Hello, this video is associated with how we are identifying documents in our indexing process. The volunteer handbook gives the initial guidance associated with how we are identifying individual deeds. You'll notice here in the table we have, the headings county, county code, the book or volume, page, document ID, and document type. And this is the information that we're using in terms of identifying the document. And you'll notice let's take this first item in the table from Guilford County, the county code, GUI, its book or volume here we have is a 9, page number 340. And notice the document ID. It's the information that's in these 3 columns here, each followed by a dot. And then there's the last number, which is 1. Which is the first document that's found on that book and that page that's here. So if we had another document that was on the same volume and page that was in Guilford County, we would have a .2 in that particular case. We have it's a deed of trust, which is the type. So let's just enter some of this information here first. So I'll flip over to our spreadsheet. So you would get a spreadsheet. Let's use this one here. So we have Guilford County, and we had this again. It's just an example. GUI, the book or volume was 9. The page we had in that example was 340, and then the ID was GUI.9.340.1 for the first one, and we have this one row is associated with that particular document. All right, and so here's what we've got. And then there are multiple document types. We've got a drop down here, and I'll read them here. Bill of sale, deed of gift, deed of trust, deed, apprentice bond, will, partition in kind, partition by sale, emancipation of slave or slaves, marriage contract or other. And so we would key in the appropriate information. I think this was a deed of trust. And that's what we would key into our spreadsheet to identify this particular document. And again, one row for everything that we're doing associated with this particular document. Let's go back to the handbook, and there is some following on information. We can certainly see where the identification, you'll see the identification that's being made, deed number per page, and there is a special exception here because, as I said earlier, each document receives only one entry or line in the spreadsheet, regardless of the number of individuals mentioned. And here's the exception. That drop-down list that I mentioned, there were 2 types of partitions, partition in kind and partition in sale. In those cases, you're going to have one grantor and multiple grantees, and in which case you'd have a separate row for each of the grantees. That's the only case, those 2 are the only times when you'd have a separate row. Otherwise, if you have only, you can have one or multiple grantors, but if you have one grantor and multiple grantees, then you would have to have multiple rows in your spreadsheet. The example that's shown in your handbook is shown here. The example is in Iredell County. We have an individual, a James Clark, and James Clark is, and you'll see later in this handbook, has a will associated with multiple individuals. The first 3 are shown here: David Clark, John Clark, and James Clark. It's like a son named James Clark. And so they are being willed the property of the elder James Clark here in this particular case. So again, that gets to the issue about that one exception, partition in kind, right? Partition in kind and partition in sale, by sale. Document types. There was the drop down associated with the document types, and those are listed here in the handbook. Bill of sale. How do you know it's a bill of sale? It's going to say, for and in consideration of the sum of some amount of money to me, him in hand paid. Or it'll say, I have granted, bargained, and sold, and do grant, bargain, and sell. Those are identifiers that say you have a bill of sale. It's a deed of gift, right? We're transferring legal ownership. So, for example, it could say, for and in consideration of the natural love and affection. Or it could say, do give and grant, and have given and granted. So there's no sale taking place. We're just giving away property. Deed of trust. Deed of trust says, we've got some collateral here put up for money owed. So the grantor, who we'll talk about later, puts up property to somebody else, the grantee, and it will say for the nominal sum of, typically it will say $1. That's there. You can identify these. It says held and firmly bound in the sum of, or stands lawfully indebted to. Those are some key phrases there associated with identifying a deed of trust. Next, we have partition in kind. And this says we have each heir gets a certain amount of property. So we're giving away the property. So typically there's a will, and you have one grantor, and we have multiple grantees. And the heirs, it could be the wife or the husband, it could be the children, but they'll be listed. But that's a partition in kind. And if we have multiple grantees, multiple receivers of the property, we will have one row for each of those grantees, only if it's a partition in kind or a partition by sale. And in this particular case, it divides, and I'll read here, the inheritance between heirs, but by selling off the property and distributing the proceeds of that sale to the heirs. And so the grantor is the person whose estate is being partitioned along the way here. All right. It says, and I'll read this last sentence, because we are interested in tracking the movements of enslaved persons, the names of the heirs are not relevant during the indexing phase because they're receiving money, not enslaved people. They will appear in the final transcript. There will be full transcripts at some point in this project. Next, we have is the apprentice bond, and this is in the handbook. It describes the conditions under which an apprentice bond will take place. And notice at the bottom here it says, in this case, it says the apprentice bonds make direct mention of the apprenticeship being either entered or released. In this case, there will be no grantor and no grantee, right? And in that case, you will write none. And as you'll hear in later videos, we have no blank spots. So if there's no grantor or there's no grantee, we would place none in the appropriate spot. Another type of deed here, we have a will and testament, right? Words you can look for, the uncertainty of this mortal life, and something about the mental state, of sound mind and body, or weak of mind, but sound and perfect memory. There may also be the phrase, revoke and disannul all former wills heretofore made. So you can recognize a will. Emancipation. The individual or individuals may have been emancipated. Now, generally, that's going to be a court proceeding, but it may show up in a deed or a will. Not in deeds, but in wills, and we would handle appropriately. Marriage contract. This might look similar to a deed of trust, but it is not. And this one deserves some conversation here. Single woman could own property, but a married woman did not have or had few property rights. So to protect her property before she was married, she would create a special deed of trust in which she sells her property to a trusted man, usually a relative, for a small fee. This property then stays in her family and is inherited by her offspring, and it's protected from her husband. Otherwise, if she had not done this, when she gets married, all of the property is the property of the husband. And so for those particular items, we're going to classify those deeds as marriage contracts, not deeds of trust. All right. The grantee is whoever is listed as the trustee. It's the relative or whoever is listed as the trustee. That's the person who effectively has purchased by that very small fee. They have purchased the property. And if we do not have any of that other information, we would just select other. So that completes the section associated with types of deeds and the basic information that we have to place in our spreadsheet, which is county code, book or volume, page, the document ID, and here's the example, and choose from the drop down the appropriate type of deed. Thanks much.